Fame surrounded him everywhere he went. Crowds screamed his name. His music traveled farther than his footsteps ever could. Yet there were nights when Bob Marley sat alone, listening not to applause, but to silence. Not the peaceful kind. The heavy kind. The kind that presses against the chest and reminds a man that being seen by the world does not mean being known by it. By the mid-1970s, Bob Marley was no longer just a musician. He had become a symbol. His face appeared on posters. His words were chanted by people who had never met him. His songs spoke of unity, resistance, and love, echoing across borders and oceans. To the outside world, Bob Marley looked surrounded by purpose and power. But inside, something was quietly breaking. This was not the loneliness of failure. It was the loneliness of arrival. Bob had grown up poor, mixed race, and out of place in Jamaica. From an early age, he learned how it felt to stand between worlds and belong fully to none. Music became his refuge. Rhythm became his language. But fame changed the shape of his solitude. It did not remove it. It magnified it. As his audience grew larger, his circle grew smaller. People wanted pieces of him, his time, his image, his voice. Very few wanted his doubts. Fewer still wanted his silence. Every interview demanded answers. Every performance demanded energy. Every appearance demanded strength. There was no room for exhaustion, no space for weakness, and certainly no patience for a man who wanted to sit quietly and think. Bob Marley carried the weight of expectation like a second spine. Behind the stage lights, he was often distant. Not cold, just elsewhere. Friends noticed it in his eyes. A faraway look, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. He spoke less than people expected. And when he did speak, he chose his words carefully, as if wasting them would cost him something he could not afford to lose. The world called him a prophet, a leader, a voice for the oppressed. But prophets are rarely asked how they feel. Leaders are rarely allowed to rest. And voices are rarely permitted to fall. Silent. At night, in hotel rooms that all looked the same, Bob would sit with his guitar untouched. Music had once saved him. Now it followed him everywhere, demanding more. Songs poured out of him, but each one seemed to take something with it. A memory, a feeling, a piece of himself he was not sure would return. There were moments when he wondered whether people loved the message more than the man. He watched crowds sing his lyrics with joy, not knowing they were born from pain. He heard chants of peace shouted by people who had never lived through violence. He smiled for photographs taken by strangers who believed they knew him because they knew his songs, but they did not see the quiet moments, the hesitation before speaking, the weight in his chest when the noise finally stopped. Bob Marley was surrounded by millions, yet deeply alone, and that loneliness was about to shape the most honest music of his life, in ways the world was not ready to understand. Silence around him was growing louder. The loneliness did not announce itself loudly. It crept in quietly, disguised as responsibility. Bob Marley was expected to be present everywhere and nowhere at the same time. On stage, he belonged to the crowd. Off stage, he belonged to expectations. Very little of him belonged to himself. Anymore. Tour after tour blurred together. Cities changed. Accents shifted. Hotel walls remained the same. The applause at the end of each night sounded powerful, but it faded too quickly, leaving behind a silence that felt sharper than before. Bob would sit alone after performances, sweat still cooling on his skin, listening to the echoes of thousands disappear into nothing. People assumed fame would protect him from doubt. In truth, it made doubt heavier. Those closest to him began to notice how often he withdrew. Not from anger, not from arrogance, but from exhaustion. Conversations became shorter. Smiles took more effort. There were moments when he would stare at the ground for long stretches, as if searching for something he had dropped years ago and never found again. The pressure was not only external. Bob carried an internal burden that few understood. He believed deeply in the message he shared: love, unity, freedom. But living those values every day, under constant scrutiny, came at a cost. Every contradiction was judged. Every silence was questioned. Every personal moment became public property. He was expected to be peace itself. Even when the world around him was violent, there were nights when Bob felt the distance between the man and the symbol stretch painfully wide. Fans did not see the tired father, the quiet thinker, the man who needed space to breathe. They saw a figure who seemed endlessly strong, endlessly calm, endlessly available, but strength without rest becomes a burden. Bob's faith sustained him, but it also isolated him. His spiritual path was deeply personal, rooted in reflection and solitude. Yet the world wanted explanations, slogans, sound bites. They wanted answers quickly, cleanly, and without complexity. Bob offered truth slowly and often through silence. That silence was misunderstood. Some mistook it for arrogance, others for mystery. Few recognized it as protection. Even among friends, Bob sometimes felt unreachable. Fame rearranged relationships. People listened differently now. Words carried weight. Jokes felt watched. Trust became fragile. It was harder to know who was there for the music and who was there for the man, and so he learned to guard himself. He poured what he could not say into his songs. Melodies became confessions. Lyrics became quiet prayers. Each new track carried pieces of his loneliness, wrapped carefully so the world would hear hope instead of pain. But the loneliness did not leave. It waited in the moments before walking on stage. It waited in the long drives between venues. It waited in the pauses between questions he chose not to answer. It grew stronger the more people believed they knew him. Bob Marley was becoming more famous than ever and more alone than he had ever been. That inner distance was about to collide with a moment that would force him to confront what fame had taken from him and what it could never replace. The crowd would not see it coming. The loneliness reached its sharpest edge not in silence, but in moments of closeness. When people stood right beside him, smiling, speaking, reaching for him, Bob often felt the widest distance of all. Fame had surrounded him with bodies, but it had also stripped away privacy, simplicity, and the freedom to be unseen. There were mornings when Bob woke before sunrise, long before assistants or schedules or expectations claimed the day. In those quiet hours, he would sit alone, sometimes with the guitar resting untouched beside him. The world knew him as a man of sound, but these moments were filled with stillness. It was here that the weight settled in. He missed anonymity. Not because he rejected the people, but because anonymity allowed honesty without performance, without explanation, without symbolism. Once, he could walk through a street and simply exist. Now, every step carried meaning assigned by others. Even joy came with conditions. Laughter felt monitored. Anger felt forbidden. Sadness felt dangerous. He had become a vessel for hope, and vessels were not meant to crack. So he learned to hide the fractures. He spoke gently even when he felt tired. He stood calmly even when his chest felt heavy. The contradictions wore him down. At home, when the music stopped and the lights faded, Bob tried to reconnect with the parts of himself untouched by fame. He held on to small rituals, quiet conversations, familiar smells, memories of places where his name carried no power. These were not escapes. They were attempts to remember who he had been before the world decided who he was supposed to be. But even home was no longer untouched. Visitors arrived. With reverence, Questions followed him into private spaces. Expectations crossed boundaries without asking permission. He felt responsible for everyone's emotions, everyone's beliefs, everyone's hopes. Saying no felt like betrayal. Saying yes felt like erasure, and yet he rarely complained. Instead, Bob listened. He absorbed. He carried Dot. He watched how people projected their pain onto him, believing he could hold it, believing his presence alone could heal wounds he did not cause. Some nights, after everyone had gone, he felt that borrowed pain settle inside him like something permanent. The world praised his calm, unaware of the discipline it took to maintain it. There were moments when he questioned whether the message was worth the personal cost. Not because he doubted the truth of love or unity, but because he wondered how long a man could give without receiving the same depth in return. How long one could be seen as a symbol before forgetting how it felt to be understood. Still, he continued, because stopping felt like abandonment, because silence felt dangerous, because the people listening believed in him in ways that left no room for retreat. Bob Marley stood at a crossroads that few could see. One path demanded that he remain the figure the world had built. The other required confronting a loneliness that fame could not cure, and music could not fully explain. A moment was approaching when this inner struggle would surface quietly, unexpectedly, in front of others. Not through words, not through song, but through a choice that would reveal how deeply alone he had felt, even at the height of being loved. And that moment would change how people remembered him forever. That moment did not arrive with drama or confrontation. It came quietly, almost unnoticed at first, the way the most honest truths often do. Bob Marley was standing among people who adored him, yet he felt strangely invisible. Not unseen, but unheard. Not ignored, but misunderstood. He had been invited to speak, not to sing, just to talk, to share thoughts, to offer wisdom. The room was full of attentive faces, people waiting for something profound, something comforting, something that would confirm the image they already carried of him. They expected confidence, certainty, answers. Bob paused longer than usual. Silence. Stretched. Not awkward, but heavy. The kind of silence that asks questions of its own. In that pause, Bob felt the full weight of who he had become to others. He was no longer allowed to be unsure, no longer allowed to search out loud. The world wanted him complete, finished, resolved. But inside, he was still wrestling with doubts that fame had only sharpened. He realized then that loneliness was not the absence of people. It was the absence of permission. Permission to be fragile. Permission to be incomplete. Permission to be human. He spoke softly, choosing his words as if each one mattered more than applause. He did not say much. He did not explain everything. He did not offer easy comfort. Instead, he spoke about listening, about patience, about the danger of mistaking noise for connection. Some nodded. Some seemed confused. Others waited for something stronger. Bob could feel the distance again. The space between what he was trying to express and what people were prepared to hear. Afterward, the room filled with conversation, laughter, praise. People told him how powerful he was, how inspiring, how necessary. Bob thanked them politely. He smiled. He listened. And yet, he felt the same quiet separation return. Later, alone, he reflected on the irony. His music connected millions, but connection did not always mean closeness. Love, when directed at an idea, could leave the person behind it untouched. He wondered how many people truly saw him beyond the songs, beyond the message, beyond the role he played so well. The realization did not make him bitter. It made him careful. From that point forward, Bob became even more deliberate with his silence. He allowed himself fewer words, but deeper ones. He protected moments of solitude not as weakness, but as survival. He learned that giving endlessly without grounding oneself led not to peace, but to quiet erosion. The loneliness did not disappear. It changed shape. It became something he carried with awareness rather than confusion, something he understood rather than feared. But understanding it did not lessen its weight. It only clarified its presence. Bob Marley was loved by the world, yet there remained parts of him that no crowd could reach. And soon, faced with a decision that tested everything he believed about connection, legacy, and truth, he would be forced to confront that loneliness openly in a way no one expected. That moment would finally reveal what fame had given him and what it could never give back. Asterisk. The final realization came not on a stage, not in a studio, and not in front of cameras. It came in a quiet place, away from noise, where Bob Marley was finally alone without an audience waiting for meaning. By then, fame had reached a level few artists ever experience. His music traveled faster than he could. His face was recognized before his voice was heard. His message was quoted by people who had never asked how heavy it was to carry. Everywhere he went, he was welcomed, celebrated, needed. And yet, the loneliness he felt had not been defeated by success. It had only become clearer. Bob began to understand something painful but honest. The world loved what he represented, but very few people asked how he was holding up underneath it. His strength had become an expectation. His calm had become a requirement. His smile had become a responsibility. There were nights when he sat quietly, listening to his own recordings, not as an artist, but as a man. He heard conviction in his voice, hope, courage, but he also heard a question beneath it all, a question he had been asking since he was young. Who sees me when the song ends? He never blamed the people who loved him. He understood them too well. Music had given them comfort. His words had given them language for pain they could not name. In return, they offered admiration, applause, devotion. But admiration could not sit beside you in silence. Applause could not listen. Devotion could. Not always understand. Bob chose not to fight this truth. He chose to accept it. Instead of trying to be less lonely, he became more honest. He stopped pretending that being loved by millions meant being known. He stopped expecting the world to carry him the way he carried it. And in doing so, something shifted. He began to treasure smaller moments, a quiet conversation, a shared laugh, without an audience, a pause that did not need to be filled. He learned that intimacy does not scale. That truth does not multiply with fame, that some connections are meant to remain small, fragile, and real. In his final years, those closest to him noticed a change. Bob spoke less about changing the world, and more about understanding it, less about unity as an idea and more about compassion as an action. He had made peace with the fact that loneliness was not a failure. It was a cost of feeling deeply, of caring without armor, of choosing love even when it does not return in equal measure. Bob Marley did not die misunderstood, but he did live knowing that no amount of fame could replace being truly seen. And instead of letting that truth harden him, he allowed it to soften him. That is why his music still feels alive, because it was never written from a place of comfort. It was written from a place of longing, from a man who stood in front of the world and still reached inward, searching for something honest. Bob Marley felt alone even when famous, not because he lacked love, but because he understood it too deeply to mistake noise for connection, and that understanding became his quiet legacy, one that still listens back.